Is the Shroud of Turin real? Well, it's a thing, but science has evaluated it and found, as happens with every other religious supernatural claim, that it's just not what the religious pretend that it is. Of course, the religious don't care, they just really want to believe, and that's why it's such a waste of time to engage them on the field of intellect and evidence. But let's see what happens anyhow. We're going to look at a video today from a channel called Christian Way on the Shroud of Turin. Now, normally I don't do videos like this, not because I can't, but because trying to have a rational, evidence-based conversation with the religious is a pointless waste of time, as I think we're going to see here. They don't care about the facts, and where the facts contravene their faith, they go with faith every single time. Therefore, what's the point? They're not listening to reason, because reason and belief are two completely different things, and they often contradict each other. They just don't care. But let's give it a shot anyhow. What could go wrong? Well, since you have none at all right now, anything has to be an improvement. Remember the kind of stuff that we usually see claimed. But I really like the idea. Great, I guess, but that doesn't make it evidence. But it says so in my book. Big deal. Lots of books say lots of things. That doesn't make any of them true. You'd need to support these claims with actual demonstrable evidence, and you just don't have any. And this is why faith is so meaningless. What you really wish was true doesn't make a difference. It only matters if it's verifiably true. And for that, you need evidence. Not wishful thinking, not emotional comfort, not, but I really like it. Actual, demonstrable evidence that the thing that you're claiming is so actually is. You got any of that? I didn't think so. And I have my suspicions about this video too. But I guess we'll see, won't we?
Dear brothers and sisters, many times, despite the faith that animates many of us, some wonder why Jesus did not leave indisputable signs, undeniable evidence of his existence, his coming, and his resurrection.
Because that sure would have been handy, wouldn't it? And I've asked that a lot, and I've had Christians tell me that if Jesus or God had left undeniable evidence that they were real, then you wouldn't need faith, would you? As if that's a good thing. Because faith is not a virtue. It's an excuse that the gullible give themselves to believe things that aren't verifiably true. Of course, that makes a lot of these people mad to demean their fantasy thinking, because these people are not rational thinkers if they're actually thinking at all. Well, too bad. I don't care if you get mad. Evidence is all we need. Having no evidence means that nobody with two brain cells to rub together ought to believe it. Why doesn't it ever work that way for the religious? I don't know, you tell me.
At times, even some of us are overcome by discouragement, doubts, and fears that our faith may falter. Thus, we embark on a search for evidence to dispel the troubling thoughts that challenge our faith in God.
You mean that thing that you've got no business at all having, right? Just because it makes you feel good to think that this magical God thing in the sky is real, that doesn't mean that God is real. It's why my estimation of someone's intelligence falls precipitously when I hear them talking about their faith. Faith sucks. It just does. You should never have religious-style faith in anything. And that's why Hebrews 11:1 is written the way that it is. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It doesn't matter what you hope for, and if you don't see it, then it's not evidence, is it? That's why we have to define our terms very specifically and insist that people stick to those definitions. Evidence is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. Not what you believe, not what you like, not what makes you feel good. The things that are actually true. When I'm talking about evidence, that is what I mean. Or to put it another way, evidence for a proposition is what supports the proposition. It is usually understood as an indication that the supported proposition is true. If you cannot objectively or demonstrably support your claim, then there is no reason at all to think that your claim is true, and thus no reason why anybody with a brain ought to believe it. You've got to support it first. You can't just believe it because it makes you happy. So, anyway, let's continue.
We often say that true faith does not require any proof or phenomenon, but rather it is an intimate connection with God that we feel within ourselves beyond tangible evidence. And this is absolutely true.
It's absolutely true that that kind of faith is mindless and meaningless because having imaginary friends, no matter how it might make you feel, is absolutely ridiculous. Now, I certainly can't stop you from doing it, but I can roll my eyes when you show up at my doorstep trying to tell me about your farcical faith. If you want to convince others what you believe is true, and that's what this video purports to do. After all, it's called the evidence of God's existence that you cannot ignore, so you better be able to present something other than, well, my book says a thing and it makes me happy. Because if that's all that happens, and I figure we all expect that's all they're going to do, then I'm going to be very, very disappointed. Not surprised, mind you, but very disappointed.
However, it is also true that we cannot ignore certain signs, especially what Jesus has left for all of us. If you are wondering if there is a sign that can prove the real existence of Jesus and his promise of resurrection, the answer is yes, there is.
Not so far as the actual evidence shows. Now, I will admit, I am not an expert in the Shroud of Turin. It's been debunked, and that's pretty much all we really need to say about that, but this is something that a lot of Christians can't give up because they just really, really want it to be true. They are looking for something, anything that they can use to say, see, we were right all along. It's just that none of their empty claims impress anyone outside of their own pathetic echo chamber. It's why these videos aren't being made for us. They're being made for believers who just want to feel warm and fuzzy inside about the things that they already believe. This would never fly in front of a, say, scientific conference. All the faith talk needs to go away. Let's get to the actual evidence. I mean, call me skeptical, but I really don't think they have any, do you?
Jesus knows the human soul very well, and for this reason, he left signs that can bring any person, even the most skeptical, closer to faith.
Well, that's the story that you like to tell yourselves, and then when it doesn't work out for you, you come up with all kinds of bald rationalizations for why it didn't work. Well, you just want to sin. You actually believe in God, you're just lying. You know, it's all just designed to make them feel better about their own abject failures. Because everything that they do is a failure. And I don't think this is going to be any different, do you?
One of these signs is undoubtedly the Holy Shroud. Or as we can say, the Holy Shroud is the most important relic in all of Christianity, because it contains all that the Gospels have handed down to us.
Nope, it was a relic, one of many, tack a few more manys on there, that people just manufactured as a way to con the religiously gullible out of their money. How many holy foreskins are there out there again? Because in 1907, the Dominican scholar A.V. Mueller listed at least 13 separate locations that claimed to possess the sacred foreskin. Since then, the number has risen to 21 churches and abbeys who, at one point in time or another, have claimed that they had Christ's foreskin. It's just to draw in the gullible so they could make money, because that's what religion is all about. Christians are tremendously exploitable. They just aren't that bright.
It is a tangible sign that we can touch, that we can study with the most advanced technological instruments.
Not so much. They've only allowed it to be studied by scientists a couple of times, in 1977 and 1988, where they were allowed to examine particulates from the cloth. And in 1988, they radiocarbon dated a portion of the cloth and found it to date between 1260 and 1390 CE. Other than looking at images, there has been no hardcore scientific analysis, and it probably won't be allowed again because the last time they did it, it went so badly for the Catholics. Let's be honest, they were only looking for confirmation, and not receiving it, they are going to keep it under wraps like they do with all of their other so-called relics, because they don't actually care about the truth. They want science to tell them that they're right. And when science tells them that they're wrong, they go into hiding.
And this has been done for decades, and it is still being done. The Holy Shroud is analyzed by scholars from all over the world, from various disciplines, and what emerges is extraordinary because all the studies converge and scientifically prove the reality of our faith.
No. Exactly what studies are you looking at, because they don't actually say? Because not one has ever found it to have come from the right area, from the right time, and certainly it hasn't confirmed the existence of Jesus. In fact, no matter what happened, it couldn't. All you can say is that the image corresponds to something that you believe. You cannot prove, even with the best conceivable results, that it was actually present at that specific event. It doesn't prove the resurrection happened. That's just something that the religious can use to confirm their biases, which is probably why it was created in the first place back in the Middle Ages. Plus, it was a good way to make money, which it's been used for ever since. This is just talking up a myth to the believers because they're desperately looking for a reason to keep believing. That doesn't make any of it true, and it certainly doesn't make any of it evidence.
The Holy Shroud is an immensely powerful divine sign because it allows all of us to see the real face of Christ after more than 2,000 years.
That's your story, but that's all that it is. A story. And as I'm writing this, another video just went up, the one about Jesus in the clouds and the nonsensical airplane ride. That guy kept saying that we'd never see Jesus' face except after we died. Because these people can't keep their own stories consistent, can they? Because these are just articles of faith, not fact. They just really want it to be true. But that doesn't make any of it true. This is why you would need evidence. And they simply don't have any.
Through that precious cloth, we are able to see Christ in the same way the apostles saw him. An extraordinary photograph that has endured for millennia.
Well, except for the fire and all, because God couldn't keep it from almost burning up in 1532, could he? That's why it's so ridiculous that the religious keep saying, well, it's a miracle. Not much of a miracle if it got severely damaged by something so mundane and elemental as a fire. Yet this is the kind of thing that we hear from the religious all the time. It's just spin. Well, it could have been destroyed forever, but it got saved. Yeah, that's the same kind of cherry-picking nonsense when they say, let's look at that part of the church that survived the natural disaster, ignoring all the Christians and other churches that got destroyed in the process. It's just cherry-picking, and it's just childish. But what else is new, right?
We can call it a photograph because it comes closest to the reality of the Holy Shroud.
No, that's an assertion, but that's already been debunked. In 1978, when Walter McCrone studied particulate matter sampled from the shroud, he found that the image was just painted onto the cloth with a diluted solution of red ochre pigment in a gelatin medium. The supposed bloodstains were just painted with vermilion pigments. In 2010, Gregory S. Paul showed that the proportions on the shroud were impossible. No actual human being could have proportions of that size. the forehead is too small, and the arms are too long, and they're actually of different lengths. This could not possibly have been real. In 2018, a bloodstain pattern analysis was performed, which showed that the blood patterns on the forearms and the back of the hand, they were not connected and would have to have occurred at different times. All of this proves that the Shroud of Turin is the product of an artist, not of actual events. But, good luck getting them to believe that, right?
The image does not arise from any color. There are no pigments on the cloth.
Absolutely false, as I already said. This is what they want to believe, but they're just wrong. And this isn't even a new thing. People have been doubting the Shroud nearly as long as it's been known. The Shroud was denounced as a forgery by the Bishop of Troyes in 1389. It was bought by the House of Savoy in 1563, mostly because I figured they knew a cash cow when they saw one, and it's been making money for the Catholic Church ever since. Now, I'm not saying that people haven't believed it because, of course, they're just looking for reasons to believe, but there is no evidence whatsoever that it is now or has ever been authentic, and every reason under the sun to think that it's not. This just shows the utter desperation of the religious mind, clinging to something that has been definitively proven to be false because they simply can't accept that their asinine beliefs aren't absolutely true, because the religious are just dumb. You need no further proof than this.
It is as if the image has been impressed in a way that remains unknown to us even today.
No, we know pretty much how it was done. In fact, Joe Nickel wrote a book in 1987 called Inquest of the Shroud of Turin, in which he showed exactly how the image could have been printed. Not exactly, we don't know exactly how it was done, but we can sure come up with ways that it could have been done. So, not only do we have the evidence of the pigments used, we have a reasonable explanation of how it could have been done and produced the same effects. This is just desperation on display, and that is nothing to be proud of.
Numerous theoretical and experimental hypotheses have been put forward to explain and, if possible, reproduce it, but none have yielded satisfactory results.
Except they have. Oh, I know, satisfactory is such a wiggle word, especially if you're desperate to maintain your own faith, and this is, once again, why we have to pay attention to the language used by the religious, because it's always very telling. Well, I don't like that. Well, of course not. You're absurdly biased. You want it to be true, but that doesn't make it true. Taken collectively, all the evidence is very, very clear. This is a production of a Middle Ages artist for reasons we can only guess at, but it does not represent the actual burial shroud of Jesus. All the faith in the world isn't going to make it so.
The heat experiment, where an attempt was made to impress a cloth with a heated metal bas relief, failed because the resulting image penetrated the linen much more deeply than that of the shroud, which, on the other hand, is only superficially imprinted on the outer part of the fibers.
Still wrong. And this is the problem with the way the Catholic Church controls access to the shroud. Now, yes, I do understand why they do it from their perspective. If it was legitimate, then it would be an invaluable relic. However, there are just as many reasons to keep it under lock and key and away from prying eyes, because every single time they've let anybody from beyond the faith take a look, it just hasn't gone well, and then it's been decades of bald rationalizations to explain away all the findings. Well, it could have been like this. In fact, the failure of the radiometric dating has led some Christians to claim that the part that was tested, well, it was just an unknown and entirely invisible repair from the Middle Ages, for which they've got no evidence whatsoever, because the shroud just has to be real. It's this kind of absurd desperation that marks religious belief. Even the most recent analysis from 2020 concluded that the stated date range from the 80s was inaccurate because it was 88 years too young. So the shroud is even more unrelated to Jesus than it was before. It just gets more absurd every time you look at it.
The use of dyes, both wet and dry, was discarded as it was ascertained that there are no pigments or traces of brush strokes, not even microscopic ones, between the linen fibers. The image was not created by human hands. Recent experiments with lasers have been very intriguing. Ultraviolet light pulses have altered the structure of small samples of linen, producing a coloration seemingly similar to that of the shroud.
Well, not quite. They blasted the cloth with UV at various power levels and said that they achieved a very superficial, shroud-like coloration of linen yarns in a narrow range of irradiation parameters. The best effect came with laser pulses lasting less than 50 nanoseconds. Except, it kind of looks like it to me, doesn't really mean anything, does it? The problem with all of this is that it isn't going to prove anything at all. Even if we couldn't replicate the results, even if we couldn't prove that the shroud was from the Middle Ages, even if all of the evidence that was stacked up against the shroud didn't exist, that wouldn't prove a damn thing about Jesus. Because here's the thing, even if we can't find you wrong, that doesn't prove you're right. Your assumptions don't get proven true just because other people can't prove them false. You actually have to show that the things that you believe are true, and as we all know, the religious just aren't interested in that. They believe that, well, it's got to be true, no matter what. Then again, this whole video is about comforting the believers and not about justifying the beliefs. It's really just a waste of time.
However, the differences from the original are still enormous. The coloration remains too deep and uniform, whereas in the shroud, it appears as if someone, with microscopic vision, meticulously chose which fibrils to color and which to leave uncolored, achieving the chiaroscuro effect by varying the percentage of colored and white areas.
Welcome to Religious Interpretation 101. But it seems so to me. That doesn't mean anything. This is what happens when you start with a foregone conclusion, reach for entirely emotional reasons, and then go hunting for any reason you can find, even if you just have to make it up, to declare that your conclusion was right all along. And this is exactly what the religious are doing. They assume, wrongly, that their beliefs are the default, right up until you prove them wrong, and then they just deny that anyone can prove them wrong, even if they do, because they have a vested interest in believing the things that they believe because they make them feel good. You don't just get to declare that God done it if you haven't been able to show that God done it. The default isn't God. The default is we don't know. Now we have to figure out what actually happened, and we do that by following the evidence to its most logical, rational conclusion. And the religious don't want to do that. They just really want to believe.
Furthermore, it would require an incredibly powerful laser to produce an image as large as that of the Turin shroud. Additionally, the linen behind the bloodstains on the shroud is not colored, as if the forger first deposited the blood and then precisely colored the linen around each stain, instead of creating the image and staining it afterward, which would be logical for an artificial object.
You know, this whole thing comes off as a massive bald rationalization, right? Because the problems facing the shroud being authentic are pretty much insurmountable at this point. Instead of figuring out why the radiometric dating says it's impossible and proving that it's incorrect, something they don't even try to do, they just assume that the shroud is right. They throw in a bunch of empty claims and say, well, it could have been this. Well, I'm sorry, but it could have been isn't the same as it is. If you look at the description of this video, there isn't a single link to a peer-reviewed scientific study or anything else to attempt to justify any of the claims that they're making. It's just empty claims that they are desperately hoping will stick to the wall, even though with a few moments research, you can show that it's just not true. These are just things that they wish could be real, but wishing doesn't mean anything, does it?
We should also consider the anatomical precision, the difficulty of creating an image that becomes practically invisible at a distance of less than 1.5 meters, the three-dimensionality, and other subtleties.
We've already addressed that. Maybe I just jumped the gun, but This is not the image of a real person unless he was deformed. Human proportions are very predictable, and the ones on the shroud are just wrong. Explain that. They can't, they don't even try, which is why they are just pandering to the already faithful instead of trying to get their findings published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. That's the difference between being scholarly and being apologetic. The forum for scholarly work, it's not YouTube. The format for scholarly work isn't, but I have faith, or it seems to me. Yet this is all that they do, right? Start with the assumption of a god, that your magical man god was real in the first place, and then just fill in the blanks with faith and fifis. But that doesn't make you look credible, does it? It just makes you look stupid.
It is evident that the difficulty we face in finding an explanation for the shroud today makes it really hard to believe that it could have been produced by a medieval forger, as some skeptics are inclined to think.
No, it's really easy. What is difficult is actually placing the shroud at the right time and in the right place, as would be required by it being legitimately real. Because if it was real, then all of these pieces would have fallen into place without having to run around with the goalposts. The radiometric dating would have lined up. All of the scans would have shown, some kind of supernatural evidence. We wouldn't have found all the things that we found, all of the things that the religious just don't like. Because, and we can go to crap like the supposed Ron Wyatt finds, where absolutely nothing at all lines up because he was just a con man and was only pandering to Christians, and the whole thing turns into a giant laughingstock. That is exactly what the Shroud of Turin is. A massive laughingstock, only believed by people who have a religious agenda to push because they really want it to be true. Because these people just aren't that bright, and they're certainly not at all rational. And that's sad, isn't it?
The carbon-14 dating of the shroud to the medieval period has already been refuted by many scholars. So at this point, we find ourselves facing the miracle of the shroud.
No, you haven't debunked anything. You've just said, but I don't want to believe it, and just swept it all under the rug. When has any legitimate scientist ever tested the shroud and come up with accurate numbers? Where was any of that published in any peer-reviewed scientific journal? Instead, they're just going, well, we don't like it, and pretending that makes it all okay. This is why the shroud was examined scientifically in the first place. Because it isn't a matter of faith. It's a matter of fact, and the facts just don't line up on the side of the faithful. It doesn't matter how much they really hate that reality, the reality remains, and until they can prove the reality of their own beliefs, the fact is that the shroud is bunk. Miracles don't matter. Miracles, as far as we can tell, don't exist. The facts do. Deal with it.
This tangible miracle that we can study, analyze, and that despite everything, confirms every aspect of our faith. The existence of Christ, the tortures endured, the death, and the resurrection.
Sorry, maybe I looked away for a second. I must have missed where you actually proved any of that. This is getting positively silly. Well, here's what the evidence shows. Well, we don't like that. Well, it doesn't matter what you like. This is what the evidence shows. No, it doesn't, because that's what we say. No, you're just being an idiot. Well, you're a bigger idiot and persecuting our faith. This is just stupid. This is why I don't usually do videos like this on, creationism, things like that, because this is how the religious people operate. Well, we don't like the science because it gets in the way of our faith. But there isn't any hard evidence on their side. They're just trying to snipe at the science, often with completely empty claims, so they can just get back to believing the stuff that makes them feel good. Except none of this means a damn thing, does it?
The shroud contains a sort of gospel that speaks to us about Christ, his life, and restores his physical appearance, clearly telling us not to fear death because our Lord has risen, imprinting the traces of his resurrection on that cloth.
None of which you can prove, because this is where the whole thing completely falls apart. This is taking A physical object, an object that has been entirely debunked from the religious claims about it, and then just stapling your faith onto it because you really like the idea behind the story, even if you can't show that the story ever happened at all. Because this is like someone taking a commercially available lightsaber and then just declaring that somehow it proves that Star Wars ever happened in a galaxy far, far away. All of the evidence is that this is just a replica. And it's not even a replica since there was never a real original in the sense that Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader ever existed, but it's just a pure fantasy fulfillment using a hunk of plastic and electronics as the object of your faith. But that doesn't mean anything, does it? None of this means anything unless you can prove that the shroud is legitimate, which the religious absolutely cannot do. This is why we don't start with the assumptions that their beliefs are true. We start with the evidence, and then we look to see where the evidence takes us. If you just found this shroud somewhere without it being attached to any religious stories, and then examined it as it is, would that examination take you to any real existing resurrection? No, of course not, because that's just not how any of this works.
Therefore, dear brothers and sisters, I invite you to reflect on this wonderful gift that Jesus has left for all of us. He left this marvelous sign, allowing his image to traverse history so that each one of us could see it, touch it, and contemplate it.
You mean just believe? Because that's all this video, all any religious videos ever do. But doesn't it make you feel good to think so? Who cares? Truth doesn't rely on your fee-fees. Truth relies on the facts, and you just don't have any. If they did, the description would be filled with links to actual scientific journals and experimental data showing that this thing dates to the supposed time of Jesus. Not excuses, not claims, not, but I have faith. Actual data. Where is any of that? Because I've never seen it. Have you? No, because at least so far as I know, and I'm not an expert as I said, it just doesn't exist. Anyone who would like to prove otherwise, please go ahead and do so down in the comments, because I'd really like to see it.
We can contemplate it through prayer, but also through science.
Except you don't have any actual science on your side. You just have half-assed attempts to go, nuh-uh, and that is not at all impressive. Where is the actual science that corroborates your beliefs? Trot that out for us. Leave your faith behind because your faith doesn't matter. Your faith means nothing. Only your science does.
The shroud unites the rational and irrational, speaking to both the heart and the mind. So, dear brothers and sisters, I urge you to meditate on the significance of this gift, that it may be an additional tangible sign of God's presence in our lives, granting us comfort and hope.
No, it just makes us laugh at you. Granted, none of this was meant for skeptics because they have no means whatsoever to deal with skeptics like me, who doesn't take the empty claims and blind faith of religion seriously. I want the hard data, and sadly for them, they just don't have any. They never have, and I think it's obvious they never will. They will just have faith, and faith means nothing to anybody with a brain. We need to see the data. It's why science wanted to examine the shroud in the first place, to see if the claims made about its existence and history stood up to any kind of rational rigor. And they just don't. The science proved the claims to be wrong. That didn't change the minds of the delusionally faithful because they just don't care. They just want it to be true, but wanting something to be true only matters if it's actually true, and the only way to get there from wishful thinking to actuality is science. And the science let them down. So I guess the name of the channel is accurate, because delusion is in fact the Christian way. It's just not any way that any intelligent person should embrace, and that's saying something, because Christianity, like all religion, is just dumb. Until you've got evidence to prove otherwise, it will remain dumb. Take your faith and shove it where the sun don't shine. We are not going to be impressed.